So today I thought I'd share some thoughts with you that I've been having about mental health and cells. So firstly, let me introduce myself. I'm Anna. I did my undergraduate degree in biochemistry in Bristol. I then did a research master's looking at aspects of breast cancer metastasis. And now I'm doing a PhD in Cambridge in cell biology. And I'm particularly interested in exosomes, which are these things here. And because of the nature of my work, I have a strong emphasis on bioimaging techniques. So basically, I love cells, I think they're really cool, and I spend a lot of time looking at them. And one of the reasons for being so interested in cells is to try and work out what's happening to them when they are diseased. And this is really important in us being able to create good treatments for disease. So for example, here is an image of a cell infected with SARS-CoV-2. And these black dots represent the viral particles. And these viral particles are exponentially increasing inside the cell, and if they get too high, the cell will die. And I'm sure you can appreciate the amount of interest in biomedical research at the moment to try and cure SARS-CoV-2. However, what I have noticed is that when it comes to the treatment of psychiatric disease, addressing the cellular root of disease isn't really considered a concern for cell biologists. And so when I'm talking about psychiatric disease, I mean specific diseases in humans that cause significant behavioural or mental pattern in causing significant distress or dysfunction. And these are symptoms relating to mood, appetite, or sleep. And I have a hypothesis that I'm going to present to you today that psychiatric disease most likely does manifest inside cells. And if this is true, we should treat mental illnesses as biological diseases in much the same way we treat literally every other type of disease. So for example, celiac disease is caused by eating gluten. If you're celiac, you eat gluten, your gut epithelium becomes damaged and you can't absorb food. And we know this because we can literally see it. If you go on a gluten-free diet, the gut epithelium is restored and the effects of celiac disease diminish. And then there are diseases caused by bacteria. So for example, anthrax bacterium, probably made most famous because it may have been being developed as a weapon by the Soviets for biological warfare, is a bacteria that causes these nasty ulcers and disease. And we know this because we can literally see anthrax bacterium down the microscope. And then there are viruses. So for example, HIV, devastating disease. We didn't know what causes this disease for a long time. We now know it's a virus very similar to SARS-CoV-2, and we know this because we can see these infected cells infected with viral particles down a microscope, as you can see on this image here. And this is indeed similar to what we see with SARS-CoV-2. These SARS-CoV-2 infects the respiratory tract, and hence you get these disease symptoms of the respiratory tract. And then there are other types of diseases which have a less obvious cause. So for example, cancer is caused by mutations in DNA, which can either be inherited, sporadic, or caused by environmental factors such as smoking. We know this because we can see it and we can test it in the lab, and if you have lung cancer, you get these massive tumours that have to be removed, otherwise you'll die. And cancer comes in all different shapes and sizes. So for example, this here is a teratoma, or a monster tumour, which often occurs in ovaries. It's an ovary tumour, and because there's so much shuffling and changing of the DNA because it's cancer, you end up, if you have this, you end up growing things like teeth, cartilage and hair inside ovaries, which is proper gross. And then there are other types of diseases that are caused by plaques or build-up of undigested material. And we can see this in things like Prions disease. And a specific variant of Prions disease called Kuru, which occurs in the Fore people of Papua New Guinea, an indigenous tribe. And they have this practice of cannibalism where they would eat dead people. And what happened was this infectious protein would build up inside their brains and cause neurodegeneration. And this is a very similar, and you can see these here, this is brain tissue, and these are the plaques that are causing death of brain cells. And this is very, very similar to the pathology we see in Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, which are caused by these plaques, undigested material that sit inside brains and cause neuronal death, which causes symptoms like memory loss. But what causes psychiatric disease? At the moment, there is little research into understanding what causes psychiatric disease on a cell level. And perhaps this is fine, because perhaps it is environmental factors alone that cause mental illness. And indeed, this is the assumption that we make at the moment, that bad thoughts are a manifestation of poor life circumstance rather than structural brain abnormalities. But the more I think about this, the more it just does not make sense to me. And this is because bad things happen to everyone, but not everyone gets mentally ill. And secondly, if there's anything I've learned about cells, it is that there is huge genetic variation in how all our cells will work. So surely this must extend to how our brain cells work. And then I was doing some reading for my PhD and found that there is already some evidence that structural brain abnormalities can cause psychiatric disease. And upon revisiting these papers published in the 1990s, I found that there is a class of inherited genetic disorders called adult onset lysosomal storage disorders that can cause or be associated with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and all manner of psychiatric symptoms, including insomnia, appetite loss, depression, and psychosis. And these diseases are really interesting because they also present in children, and the early onset form of lysosomal storage disorders are absolutely catastrophic, and these children will die before they reach adulthood. And when you look at their cells and their brain cells, it's absolutely stuffed full of this accumulated cholesterol, protein, and fat, or undigested material. And this is exactly the same pathology that we see in these adults with lysosomal storage disorders that present as psychiatric illness. You can see post-mortem that their cells are absolutely stuffed full of this undigested material, which leads to enlarged neurons, and you can see this detail of the waste accumulations inside the cells here. So therefore, we know there are at least some examples that structural brain abnormalities can influence psychiatric disease. And then I did some further research and found that there are actually many biological causes or factors that can lead to psychiatric disease. So the first big player that's affecting your hormones right now, that's affecting your mood right now, are hormones. So for example, corticosteroids are a hormone that's involved in your immune system, regulation of inflammation, and the metabolism of protein and carbohydrates. And they're also used for medicinal purposes to treat allergies, skin conditions, and even cancer. And it's a pretty well-observed phenomenon that in some people who are prescribed corticosteroids, it will induce psychosis, and in some, depression. And this starts up to 3 days up to treatment. So for example, there's one paper that accounts a man who took corticosteroids and he was convinced that the bad guys had implanted a tracking device into his testicle, and so he ended up back in hospital a few days later because he tried to cut it off. And there are people who naturally have too high levels of corticosteroids, and this causes a disease called Cushing's disease. And because this is a disease that affects a hormone, and a hormone affects many parts of the body, there are a range of symptoms. So these people have a distinct phenotype. They have this moon face, and they have a buffalo hump because they put weight on their shoulders. But you also see extreme disturbances in their mood, in their appetite, and in their sleep pattern. Another hormone that's having a big effect on your mood right now is thyroxine. So thyroid hormone comes from your thyroid gland. And in pregnancy, if you don't have enough of this hormone, then children are born with low IQ or idiots. And in adulthood, if you have too much thyroid function, too much thyroid, you get hypothyroidism, which is called Graves' disease, and this leads to changes in mood, so you get depression, mania, weight loss, changes in appetite and sleep, and you also get this abnormal eye movement where the eyes sort of stick out of the skull so you can see the whites above and below the iris. If you don't have enough thyroid, you get hypothyroidism. And hypothyroidism is associated with poor memory, fatigue, lack of concentration, depression, and swollen joints like this man on this image here. And abnormal thyroid function has also been heavily researched in relation to clinical depression because it is thought to interact with other neurotransmitters in the brain. And the involvement of hormones is really interesting because the average age of the onset of psychiatric disease is post-puberty. And remember, it takes a long time to get a diagnosis of psychiatric disease. And I'm not going to discuss this in more detail now, but there is lots of evidence relating hormones to psychiatric symptoms in women during the menstrual cycle and postpartum. So how do hormones work? Hormones work by affecting cells. They are secreted by certain organs in the body. They travel around the blood system, and they will reach recipient cells with a specific receptor, and they will change the way that cell works. The next well-documented factor that can influence psychiatric disease are drugs. So it is well known that drugs can cause delusions and hallucinations, and indeed substance-induced psychosis is a very well-observed phenomenon amongst young people. And I have found reference to all of the drugs above causing psychosis. So how do drugs work? Drugs work by affecting cells. They will interact with cells and change the way they behave, and so they will change behaviour. So another worthy mention of a biological factor that's influencing your mood are neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are chemicals released by neurons, which is how neurons communicate with other neurons or other cells. And by communicating with neurotransmitters on a target cell, they will change the way that cell is behaving. And there are many, many different types of neurotransmitters, and it's a very complicated process. And also, this understanding of the system is the basis for how SSRIs or antidepressants will work. And I think I just want to note here that there is evidence here that environmental factors may change the way that cells work. So for example, you have a very traumatic event that happens in your life, and this can change the way the neurotransmitters intensity or composition is influencing your brain cells and your communication, which may affect psychiatric symptoms. So finally, autoimmune diseases are a risk factor for schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and other psychiatric diseases. And this is probably because the brain has an immune system, and any degree of inflammation can influence psychiatric symptoms. So this is by no means an exhaustive list of the biological factors that can influence mood. It's just some examples that I could find by doing a little bit of research. But what I think it does show is that changes in cells can lead to psychiatric disease. So why do I think this is important? I think this is important because this research is just not in line with how we currently perceive mental illness as a society. One disease I think this is particularly true for is anorexia nervosa. So anorexia nervosa has the highest mortality rate of any other mental illness, and over half of people diagnosed with anorexia nervosa will never recover. They will live with their disorder for the rest of their life. So, like with the treatment of coronavirus, HIV, lung cancer, CoRU, Alzheimer's disease, understanding what is happening at a cell level has been absolutely crucial in treating the disease. So what do we know about the causes of anorexia nervosa? Basically nothing. On the NHS website, the causes that are listed are in fact correlations. And correlations without an underlying mechanism mean absolutely nothing. So for example, the per capita consumption of mozzarella cheese correlates perfectly with the civil engineering doctorates awarded. The divorce rate in Maine correlates perfectly with the consumption of margarine. The consumption of chicken correlates perfectly with US crude oil imports. Does this mean that the consumption of chicken causes the US crude oil imports? Absolutely not. It's just a correlation. However, what these correlations do show is that we seem to have this idea that that bad life circumstance or life events could be the cause for anorexia, or that bad thoughts are a manifestation of life events, such as childhood trauma. So still, the causes for anorexia have not been pinned down. So how can we treat a disease when we don't even know what's causing it? So anorexia being the cause of life circumstance may indeed be true. Like other psychiatric diseases, there is a very high correlation between traumatic experiences and onset of psychiatric disease. But again, this is correlative and you can't unpick this from genetics or genetic factors. Also, bad things happen to many people, but not everyone gets mental illness. This hypothesis may also be true, but psychiatric disease will still manifest in brain cells, i.e. the mechanism of psychiatric disease will change the way, will be manifested in brain cells and will change the way those cells are working compared to normal people. And this is why I think we have to approach psychiatric diseases as biological diseases in the same way that we treat HIV, Alzheimer's disease, coronavirus, and cancer. And I think this hypothesis is important because it will change the way that we treat these diseases. So as I have said, the recovery statistics for anorexia are shockingly low. Over half of anorexics will never ever recover. And for women between the ages of 15 and 24, the risk of death from anorexia is 12 times higher than any other potential cause of death combined. And we are currently treating anorexia nervosa with talking therapy. So the NHS recommends therapy basically based on how old you are. And it will give you advice on diet, understanding how starvation affects your body, how to think of yourself better, and how to cope with your feelings. So we're trying to talk our way out of anorexia nervosa. And I find this very interesting because we don't treat any other disease like this. So can you imagine talking to someone with Cushing's disease and trying to give them advice on managing their weight, or managing their sleep, or managing their depression, when you knew they just couldn't help it because their levels of corticosteroids were just too high? I also find this attitude towards anorexia nervosa problematic because it detracts from the fact that anorexia is a psychiatric disease and there is likely to be an abnormal cell-based mechanism that can explain the symptoms. And therefore there is no need or want to understand the biology or anorexia nervosa, and no need or want to fund research to understand it. I also find this attitude problematic because it is very easy to attribute blame. So, for example, an anorexic needs to try harder to talk about food, or be more intelligent to understand the effects of starvation, or be less competitive, etc. Thirdly, in many instances, anorexics have high comorbid psychiatric symptoms, such as self-harm, anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, delusions, and there is also comorbidity in other psychiatric diseases, such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, OCD, and autism. And this is interesting because I've just told you that there are a whole bunch of biological factors that can influence these diseases and change things like our mood, our sleep, and our appetite. And finally, because we have been treating anorexia nervosa, a psychiatric disease, with talking therapy for years, the burden of anorexia is not getting better. And in fact, it's getting much worse. And I just can't help thinking that we need to change our approach to understanding these diseases in order to treat them better. And don't you think this might be worth it when the statistics are just so damning? So I think psychiatric disease will be manifested in cells. And I think the pathology of psychiatric diseases such as anorexia nervosa can be found with scientific investigation. And I think this does extend to other psychiatric diseases such as major depression, bipolar, and schizophrenia and bulimia, etc. So there have been huge advances in the way that we image and understand our brains. But these advances need to be converted into psychiatric treatments that are going to benefit those who are suffering the most. And this information also needs to be communicated to the public so we all have greater understanding and empathy into mental illness to help reduce this blame culture that is currently associated with being mentally ill. And so as a cell biologist, I think we have a lot to learn from cells. And I think there's a lot we don't understand about the brain and about psychiatric illness. And the only way to understand it better is to study it. So thank you very much for listening and for your time.